Okay, so you've got that intercultural communication exam coming up, and maybe a lot of material on difference, stereotypes, culture.
It can definitely feel like a lot.
Yeah, so we get it. This deep dive, it's really designed to, cut through that efficiently. We're pulling out the core concepts, the key theories, the definitions you absolutely need for this section.
And it's crucial, right from the get-go,
Mhm.
to understand what our sources mean by difference. It's not just there. It's something that's actively shaped.
Shaped and interpreted.
Exactly. And tied fundamentally to, well, power dynamics. That's really the foundation here.
Okay, let's dig into that, the social construction of difference. The readings really hammer this home. We don't just see differences, we make them.
You create them and then we interpret them.
And think about greetings
Yeah.
or even being on time. Seems simple, right?
But it can reflect these deeper power things where, one group's way is seen as the right way, the standard.
Right. And this isn't just happening randomly, is it? It connects to bigger ideas.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
It feeds right into who belongs, what makes a nation, even that whole West versus non-West idea.
So you establish these norms,
Yeah.
and then inevitably, some people fall outside, and they get labeled often as the other.
The ones outside the dominant standard.
Precisely. So when you hear that's just their culture, remember culture itself isn't static. It's shaped, often by power, not some fixed blueprint.
Okay. And that leads us straight into stereotypes. The sources say these aren't just like quick judgments.
No, they're presented more as tools. Tools we use to evaluate people, whole cultures sometimes.
And to sort of place them,
Mhm.
fix them in these rigid categories.
Exactly. And importantly, these tools, they're usually wielded from a position of power, of dominance.
Okay, so stereotypes have a function.
They do. Often it's about maintaining the social order, the hierarchies that already exist.
Like if you fix a group with a negative stereotype, it kind of justifies their position.
It can seem to, yeah. And we really need to recognize that not all stereotypes hit the same way.
Well, stereotypes about marginalized groups, people already may be in a tougher spot. They have a much heavier impact than ones aimed at, say, dominant groups.
That makes sense. The readings also brought up cultural essentialism. What's that about?
Ah, yeah. That's the idea, the flawed idea, really, that someone's behavior is just, like, determined solely by their culture,
As if culture is this fixed program running them.
pretty much. But the material argues against that. Our behavior comes from ongoing interactions, context, not just some cultural script we're born with.
Right. And thinking in that essentialist way makes stereotypes even more problematic.
Definitely. Because then they stop being seen as just, oversimplifications. They start looking like inherent truths.
And that's how difference gets twisted into deviance.
Exactly. If someone doesn't fit the assumed cultural box, they're not just different. They're seen as wrong or deficient somehow. And that just reinforces inequality.
So these dimensions of difference, the sources list race, gender, religion, nationality, class, ability, and so on, they're not neutral labels either.
Not at all. These are the very categories used to build hierarchies. You get the normal group,
The benchmark.
right, the benchmark,
Yeah.
and then everyone else is measured against that. And if they don't match up, they're often seen as deviant, or maybe the exception.
It's not just about numbers then, the majority group.
No, it's about who sets the norm, who enforces it.
The gender example was quite stark. Women stereotyped as emotional, irrational.
Which immediately positions them as the other compared to men who are just the default, the rational standard.
So male dominance becomes the invisible norm.
Precisely. And women's experiences get viewed through that lens as a deviation. And these constructions, these stereotypes, they work hard to keep things as they are.
Protecting the existing power structures.
Yeah. If you can make the current setup seem natural just the way things are, it's much harder to challenge. Stereotypes help solidify that.
Okay, but the sources also say stereotypes aren't fixed forever, right? They're situated.
That's a really key point.
Right.
They change depending on the historical moment, the political climate, the cultural context.
So even if a stereotype feels permanent.
That feeling is actually constructed too.
Mm.
As context shift, power shifts, stereotypes can and do change.
And to understand how they change, we need to look at discourses.
Discourses, yeah. Think of them as like the dominant ways of talking about something, the accepted narratives.
Systems of meaning that shape how we discuss topics.
Exactly. They define what's normal, what's acceptable, what's deviant. They can really box in how we understand things.
So they limit other ways of seeing.
They can, yeah. But, and this is important, discourses aren't static either. They're always being negotiated, challenged. They evolve through social struggles over meaning.
Moving to race and ethnicity. The material notes that in contemporary Europe, biologically defined race is largely rejected.
Right. But you hear a lot about ethnicity or culture instead.
And the warning is that this shift in language doesn't necessarily get rid of the underlying issues.
Exactly. It can actually mask racial inequalities. It can lead to this thing called culturalism.
Culturalism. Okay, what's the definition there?
It's basically treating culture as if it's fixed, almost like a biological thing, attributing set characteristics based on perceived culture. It's similar to the problems with older ideas of race or even sexism.
So attributing fixed traits based on perceived culture.
Yeah. And the danger is it becomes another way to exclude people, to marginalize them, but without using overtly racial terms. It still props up those hierarchies.
Just under a different name, like cultural difference.
Right. A classic example is explaining away inequality by blaming cultural differences.
Instead of looking at, say, bias in hiring.
Exactly. You just say, oh, well, their culture is different. And it shuts down the conversation about potential racism or discrimination.
Okay, so to get a better handle on all this complexity, the idea of intersectionality comes in.
Yes. Because you can't just look at one thing, like race or gender, in isolation.
They interact.
Absolutely. Intersectionality shows how these categories, race, gender, class, religion, sexuality, ability, they all overlap and interact.
So they shape someone's experience of power or lack of power together.
Precisely. You can't just pull them apart into neat boxes. Your experience is shaped by how these things combine.
Like the example of a low-income woman of color. She might face discrimination based on the combination of race, gender, and class.
Exactly. And those things compound each other. Or think about stereotypes of Muslims in Europe.
Often not just about religion.
Right. They often get tangled up with ideas about race, about nationality. It creates a very specific, often negative, combined stereotype. Intersectionality helps us unpack that complexity.
Okay. Then the focus shifts to the nation itself, also a social construct.
Very much so. It's not just lines on a map. It's an idea about who belongs, built through.
Those discourses we talked about. Language, culture, maybe race.
Yeah. And migration really throws this into sharp relief. It highlights how inclusion and exclusion actually work.
And this leads to the idea of exclusive inclusion.
Right. Where someone might be legally allowed in, they have the right papers.
But they're still blocked from fully participating, socially, economically.
Exactly. They might have legal rights, but face real barriers finding meaningful work, getting involved politically, or just feeling like they truly belong. It's inclusion, but limited.
Like being allowed in the room, but not really part of the conversation.
Kind of, yeah. And Brubaker's work offers a framework for seeing where these inequalities pop up. 4 domains.
Okay, what are they?
First, political and institutional. Think about how religious discrimination might be officially banned.
But discriminating based on language.
Right.
That often seems more tolerated or flies under the radar.
Exactly.
Hmm.
Second is the economic domain. This one's pretty clear.
Language proficiency being key for jobs.
Right. If you don't speak the dominant language fluently enough, doors close, regardless of your skills. Third is cultural and symbolic.
Like the prestige of certain languages. Or accents.
Yeah, the symbolic value attached to them. If your language or accent is looked down on, it affects your social standing.
And the last one?
Informal social relationships. Friendships, networks. Even there, exclusion can happen based on language, religion, perceived race.
Wow. So these domains all work together.
They structure that whole experience of belonging or not belonging. It's interconnected.
Which brings us neatly to language and accent and how discrimination gets disguised.
Yeah, it's often not overt racism limiting people's chances. Linguistic discrimination can be just as effective, just quieter.
Judging people on their accent, their name.
How their name sounds, yeah.
Yeah.
Or perceived language gaps. We know foreign-sounding names can disadvantage people in hiring.
And appearance plus accent can make it even harder.
Unfortunately, yes, it can intensify exclusion. And the sources warn us that focusing only on language proficiency
Can sometimes be a cover, a way to justify exclusion without mentioning race.
it can function that way, yeah. It provides a seemingly neutral reason.
Okay, zooming out to Europe specifically. Eurocentrism comes up.
Right, this deep-seated idea of Europe as the center, the universal standard everything else is measured against,
And that feeds into Europism.
which is basically defending a perceived European identity against supposed cultural threats, often tied to anti-immigrant views, the idea that other cultures are incompatible.
The Dutch example was interesting, allochtoon and autotune.
Yeah, roughly of immigrant origin versus native origin. It shows how you can maintain an us versus them distinction without using explicit racial language. It still draws lines.
Finally, Est and Trenneken's work on whiteness in Europe.
Yeah, highlighting how whiteness often functions as this invisible, unspoken norm, the powerful default setting.
So being white is just seen as normal, and anything else is marked as different.
Pretty much. Normativity gets built around whiteness. So non-white identities are often positioned as the other. May be problematic, even if race isn't explicitly mentioned. The conversation might pivot to culture instead.
Which links back to culturalism.
Exactly. So the big takeaway is, even in societies that might say they're colorblind, these racial inequalities haven't vanished.
They just operate more subtly through these discourses of culture, ethnicity, national belonging.
Precisely. They're still very much there, shaping experiences and outcomes.
Okay, so let's quickly recap the heavy hitters here. We've covered difference being socially constructed,
It's the role and function of stereotypes, especially how they relate to power.
discourses shaping what's normal, culturalism as a kind of disguised prejudice.
Intersectionality, showing how identities overlap, exclusive inclusion, those four domains of inequality.
And the persistence of racial thinking, even when masked by other terms like language or culture. And whiteness as a norm.
Yeah. That's
It's
a lot.
heavy.
But understanding these constructions is just so vital for effective intercultural communication, and definitely for the exam.
Absolutely. And remember, if you want a full summary pulling all this together, plus some really useful practice tests to check your understanding, head over to gradeguru.nl.
Definitely do that. And maybe, as you go through your day or continue studying, just notice. Notice the subtle ways language or assumptions about culture might be creating insiders and outsiders right around you. It's eye-opening once you start looking.